Good morning. Now, I think, Mr. McIntosh, we're able to begin with Dr. Kennedy.
Dr. Kennedy, indeed, my lord, yes.
Good morning. Good morning, Dr. Kennedy. As you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McIntosh, who is sitting opposite you. But first, I understand you're willing to take the oath.
I am, yes.
Right. Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth.
That I will tell the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy. Now, I anticipate that your evidence may take much of the day. We usually break at about 11:30 for coffee. But if at any stage you wish to take a break, feel free just to give an indication and we can do that. No, Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, my lord. I wonder if you can give us your full name.
Iain Thomas Robert Kennedy.
And you're currently a public health consultant with NHS Greater Glasgow.
Correct.
Right. Now, did you produce a statement for the inquiry?
I did.
Would you be willing to adopt it as part of your evidence?
I am.
Thank you. Now, what I want to say is that the statement you produced, particularly its narrative section, covers the events in quite a level of detail and in chronological order. And you might say it's quite an easy read in that section. And so what I'm proposing to do is to really just pick up issues in the events between 2015 and 2019 that arise from the narrative and do that first. And that'll take us most of the morning, I would imagine. And then I want to turn to your two epidemiology reports and reports that were around at the time from other organisations and people in the hospital, and perhaps discuss them and see if we can understand why they're different if they are and what's going on. And so what I propose to do is to start with two questions we've been asking lots of people, which is, what do you understand by an unusual microorganism?
So in the context of
these events,
the use of unusual is probably better as rare. Because I think the unusual aspect is the frequency with which they occur rather than any other particular attribute of the organism.
So various microbiologists have described it as something you rarely see in your career. You may never have seen it before. You may never have seen it once before, that sort of thing. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
That's right. The next thing is, what do you understand by the expression of contaminated water?
So I would understand that to be when there is some substance in the water supply that shouldn't be there, which might be a microorganism above the acceptable level. It might be a chemical. It might be something else, but it's something that has an impact on the wholesomeness or quality of the water.
And when you say an acceptable level, would that acceptable level be the same in all circumstances, or would it vary depending on the context of where the water was being used?
It might vary. So from a public health practice perspective, we're mainly concerned with the public water supply, where those limits are laid out in regulation. But in, for example, some hospital settings, you might want a stricter limit because the patient group who are using that water are potentially more vulnerable in a way the general population are not.
Thank you. Now, what I want to do is take you to paragraph 36 of your statement, which is page 128 of the bundle. And at this point, you're discussing the role of HPS RHI, particularly their nurse consultants and lead nurses who are attending the IMTs that you attended. And I see that you have said in the first sentence that you didn't feel that they worked with the IMT in a way you would have expected, given your experience working with national agencies in community outbreaks, and you felt that they should have been more full members of the IMT and should have taken part in all aspects of it, including consensus building. Now, what I wanted just to do is, I wonder if you have any specific examples of what you mean by that.
So, in terms of examples of what my experience of normal practice.
No, the experience of not normal practice in this case.
So I think it's a broader issue than this specific set of incidents. I think there is a different way that incidents being led by public health teams vary from incidents being led by infection control teams. Sorry, so we have these national agencies who provide expertise and advice and support. And my normal experience of working within incident management teams is they're right in the middle. They are part of a kind of a collegiate responsibility for the output, whereas with infection control, it's sometimes felt that it's more an external scrutiny role rather than a supportive role. So,
I mean,
things like saying, as HPS, we can't support this output, or some of the requests for changes to the minutes that happened during the incident. We'd often spend a long time in the incident management teams going over the previous meetings minutes, and a lot of that were HPS representatives wanting slight wording change to make it clear that they were not part of the consensus view, that it was the board's incident management team and they were separate. And I think that's unhelpful.
And are you talking about effectively 2019 at this point?
Principally 2019.
Right, okay. Because we have had some evidence on this subject from HPS, our high representatives. And I think in broad terms, they've given some evidence that since in 2019, at least, there was a tendency there to be a pushback or challenge to their involvement in IMTs from some GGC staff. Now, to be fair to the situation, we haven't yet asked the relevant member of the infection prevention control team about this, so we haven't got their perspective. But is that something that you're aware of, or that you would agree with, or how would you comment on it?
No, it wouldn't be how I would characterise what was happening. I didn't feel that the board were pushing HPS out. An example I might give there would be about the water technical group and the way HPS and HFS kind of withdrew from that. And
so when you mean the water technical group, do you mean the water technical group set up in March 2018?
Yes.
Chaired by Marianne Kane?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Which HPS and HFS attended initially and then became less frequent. And then I recall Annette Rankin describing it as saying, we were no longer required, we were told we didn't need to be there. And my recollection is it was more their decision.
And were you attending these meetings?
Yes.
Right. Now, I formed the impression, reading your statement, I wondered if this is correct, is that until at least late 2018, your involvement in the IMTs that related to the Children's Hospital that are in our Bundle 1 was to some extent at the request and intervention of Dr. Armstrong, who effectively to some extent asked for your help as public health. Have I got that right?
Yes, so it was Dr. Armstrong who asked for public health to start attending the IMTs, but once I was there and part of the IMT, that was part of the ongoing process.
So once we get to the autumn of 2018, you effectively stay because you're there,
yes.
But before then you're in and out slightly. Would that be a fair sort of broad brush analysis? You're not attending every meeting in 17, 18, are you?
Not involved at all in 17.
Yeah, and in 18 you only attend some of the meetings.
From the start of March onwards.
Yeah.
If I wasn't, after that point, if I wasn't at a meeting, it would be because I was on leave or had another...
Oh, right. So we should get the impression that, leave aside, you consider yourself to be a full
yes.
member of the IMT from March 2018?
Yes.
Well, that's helpful because you do miss a few, and I wanted to get understanding of that. Right. Now, I wonder if we can go to paragraph 46 of your statement at page 132, where you, in the middle of the page, we might zoom this up so we can get it easier to read on the screens. So if you make a half page of this, it'd be good. Yes, there we are. This paragraph 46 beginning, hospital infections linked to water can happen, but the complexity of this outbreak was very unusual. due to the identification of different organisms identified in the positive water sampling results from other parts of the hospital. The source of the contamination was unknown. If it's something like contaminated tap, you would expect the infection to be confined to one area, but this was not the case. And this raised the possibility there was a systemic issue with the water in the hospital. This was the first time you were aware of such concerns. Now, at this point, this is in, according to your statement, this is in the early months of the IMT, so this is spring 2018. What I want to do is, when we come to the epidemiology this afternoon, I want to, in effect, have had looked at this by then. What effect do these sort of complexities that you're describing in this paragraph have on the way you do epidemiology to understand what's going on? For example, do you have to do particular things in your work to take account of there being many different microorganisms?
Yes. Well, it depends on, excuse me.
There should be some water there just to your left.
It depends what sort of epidemiology you're doing, and this is something we might want to discuss, because I think it's an important point to note that the various epidemiology reports are all the same type, effectively. They're all about looking at long-term trends in positive blood culture results.
Yes.
But there are other sorts of epidemiology that you can do as part of descriptive epidemiology, some of which is noted in the minutes and noted in my statement, for example, when I'm talking about the epidemiology around the Stenotrophomonas cases in that early part in 2018, where I looked much more closely at the individual patients, which bedrooms they'd been in, what times they'd been in the hospital. There was a positive environmental sample. Had anyone been in that room? That kind of epidemiology. Essentially, you can only do when you have a single organism.
I see. So effectively, if you have this multiplicity of organisms, you're limited to this descriptive epidemiology. Whereas if you had one case of MRSA or multiple cases of MRSA, you would be able to do that and work out who'd been where and who'd used which bit of equipment and that sort of stuff. I see, right. In respect of what I want to do is I want to remember this and come back to this when we look at your report, because the question I will then ask you is, how do you understand the complexity of the outbreak as a factor within analysing it? And so I'm just parking that as a thought to come back to. If we could move on to page 134 of your statement. Paragraph 54. You are asked to discuss at this point, this is June 20, this is March 2018. So again, it's still early on in the in the water incident. Your paragraph beginning, at the IMT minutes, Dr. Iain discussed the epidemiology highlighted since the opening of the RHC, there have been 3 cases of cryptococcus reported. Now, at the end of the sentence, paragraph, you say, I agree with this statement based on information available at the time. It's a reasonable view to take, as they've identified a patient with the organism, identified a water outlet with the organism in proximity to the ward area. So it's a likely source. Now, the way I read that is that your view might have changed since then. Am I right in reading that in there, or is it just that you're observing that what you thought at the time without
I'm observing what I thought at the time.
Do you have a view from now, looking backwards?
No, I don't think my view of that will have changed.
If we go again to page 139 of your statement, paragraph 69. Well, let's look at 67 while it's on the screen. So we're going to come to a series of HPS reports, and it may be able to take this short. You've observed in a number of places in your statement that the HPS reports didn't turn up when you were expecting them to be. Is that a sort of fair summary? it's been suggested that the reason, well, there's been evidence, the reason that they did, the ones in 2018 didn't turn up when they were expected to turn up as quickly as they'd hoped, is because HPS were reacting to the incident and felt it would better to do that work reflectively after the incident had been put under control. Was that something you were aware of at the time?
No, I was aware that one of the reasons cited for the delay in this work was the broader piece of work that's been taken forward by HPS in terms of, they described it as the root and branch review of wards 2A, 2B, that they were visiting, looking at schematics and all
Yes.
that kind of stuff, that they were putting their resource into doing that first and then would return to the epidemiology work. The question for me would then be, would there have been additional resource in HPS to do those things in parallel?
Right, because it might have, in your view, have helped to have the epidemiology earlier. Now, if you nod, the person in the transcript gets terribly sad, so please do answer the question. We go to paragraph 69. I wanted to put this in context first. So we're looking again at the 27th of March 2018, in paragraph 68. And there is discussion in that minute, I don't think we need to go to it, of there being some water test positive for gram-negative pathogens and some high fungal counts in a number of locations in the hospital. And I want to just look at paragraph 69 because I'm wondering whether I've got chronologically confused. Were the filters in place on the 27th of March 2018 when that IMT is happening? The one in the previous paragraph?
I thought they were, yes, because we then stand down the IMT at that point. This is the last.
The IMT was stood down in May. Could we look at bundle 1, document 90? Sorry, I'll give you a page reference. Yes. So in the sequence, so sorry, this is page 75.
Yeah.
This is the 6th IMT, the first one having taken place only on the 2nd of March, so 3 weeks later. And so I wonder whether when you thought that the filters were fitted, because the IMT review isn't until May, and the water incident IMTs continue. Well, they continue until June.
If we could just go later in that.
Yes, next page, please. Next page. Next page. Yes, there is a discussion of filters. You're right. Page 78. Right. In that case, I'm wrong and you're right. The filters have been fitted in those 3 wards and in occupied beds in 4B. The question then arises is, if these are pre-filter samples, what about the risk to patients who go elsewhere in the hospital?
Okay, so the first thing I'm thinking looking at these minutes is I can't see mention of those results. So I do wonder whether there's also, perhaps I'm meaning May in my statement.
Right. Well, let's take this off the screen because I think I would stick with a better question that I should have asked first, which is, you've rightly observed that there were samples which show gram-negative, and you've made the observation that they're less of an issue because they're pre-filter. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this question when this is. The question for you is, if you're getting pre-filter samples with the microorganisms in them, it's fine that you fitted filters in certain wards in what I eventually described as high-risk wards, and the numbers increase. But is there not actually a real risk to patients who are within the vulnerable group who go elsewhere in the hospital for X-rays, operations, other appointments, and exposed to the water?
Yes, it would be related to that particular vulnerable group because the general patient population are a very limited risk from these organisms. And that's something that is followed up through the IMT at various
It is.
points. Are there other locations that have been missed? Has the patient journey been followed through completely.
Because that issue is still arising in 2019 when the Microbacterium chelonae cases become live, isn't it?
Yes.
And effectively, we have a conclusion in 2019 that the patient who contracted Microbacterium chelonae in May, or possibly slightly earlier in 2018, might have been exposed when they went elsewhere in the hospital, away from the filters. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay. But as you say, it confirmed there was an issue with the water supply. Let's move on to. I want to go to paragraph 71 on page 140, which is the next page. So we're now moving to the autumn IMTs, because your statements covered everything in quite detail up to this point. If we look at bundle 1, document 33. So your position is that you've been continuously involved, apart from the fact that you were on leave up until this point?
Yes.
Right. Sorry, page 140. And if we go on to the next page of your statement, so that's page 141. This appears to be a discussion of what you are reporting happens after the IMT of the 3rd of July 2018. Or do you think this is you referring to something that happens after the September IMTs? Because I'm slightly lost about the chronology.
This will be after the September.
IMTs. Right, okay. Fine. So what we'll do is so this is after the decision to decant has been promulgated.
So this is before that. This will be the week before.
All right. Well, in that case, why don't we go and look at page 169 of bundle 1. So this is an IMT from the 17th of March 2018, and you are recorded as being present. It's chaired by Dr. Inkster, and this is, for chronology, a meeting at which, if we go on to the next page, and then the page after, at the bottom we have a contingency decant. And Kevin Hill feeds back from the executive meeting which happened on Friday afternoon after the IMT. Is that the meeting you're talking about in paragraph 74?
Yes.
Right, which must have taken place on the 14th of September.
Yes.
What I simply wanted to know was, in this note in the minute, we haven't got a minute of the 14th of September in the inquiry, but we have got this report by Mr. Hill. And so in it, in the third sentence, is giving consideration to the options, the executive group will wait until drainage expert will give a preliminary scope on how they will carry out their work and see what they find. Now, I'm conscious these are minutes, but what was it that was encouraging the executive group on the 14th to wait for a drainage expert?
So I'm not sure that was discussed at the meeting on the 14th or was agreed at the meeting at the 14th. My recollection of that meeting is there was a lot of information shared, the options were discussed, and it was a case of the executive were going to go away and have further conversations and considerations about it. And I would interpret this minute as Kevin Hill reporting back on those
later conversations.
Those later conversations,
so,
which I wouldn't have been part
yes,
of.
So from your point of view as not a member of the executive group, but from someone who's at the meeting of the 14th on the Friday, that meeting does discuss the possibility of decant. To be fair to it, doesn't make a decision to approve the decant at that point, and does what, and then what happens that Kevin Hill has described here happens presumably over the weekend.
Presumably, yeah.
Presumably, and then he comes and reports this back on the Monday.
Yes.
Yes, the Monday. And then the decision to recommend the decant is effectively remade at this meeting by the IMT, and then the decision to actually decant is then made by an executive group, which is reported back the next day. Is that how I got that right?
That's my understanding, yes. Right. I wasn't present in the IMT the next day.
No. So that's helpful, because we'll ask the members of the executive group, who was present from the executive team at that Friday meeting, from your recollection?
I remember Jane Grant, the chief executive, was present. I know Jennifer Armstrong would have been there. I can't be definite about others, but there was several. I imagine the chief operating officer would have been there as well.
That was Grant Archibald?
Yes.
Yes, right. Well, there are people we can ask. That's helpful. Now, what I want to do then is to move on to page 194 of this bundle, which is the IMT of the 28th of September. Now, the reason I've gone to this is because an event sort of seems to happen at this, where you report, if we go to, if we look at your statement as well, so your statement, paragraph 84, page 143. So here you're reporting that you gave a brief presentation of your epidemiology findings at that IMT, the one we're swapping between. And then there was a discussion about the HPS report to be ready. And I recall, Professor Gibson, what I reported compared to the presentation that Dr. Peters had given at the recent routine hematology, oncology, antimicrobial use meeting. I replied that I could not comment, as I had not seen Dr. Peters' report. Now, leaving the substance for this afternoon, in a sense, it's sort of helpful that you've explained that you were told about this at the time, but that was 28th September 2018. When, if ever, did you see Dr. Peters, either the presentation that was made at that meeting or the subsequent report that she produced with Dr. Harvey Wood?
Later in 2018, couldn't be definitive whether it was October or November, but there was a point, I think, towards the end of October, possibly where Dr. Inkster was wanting to bring together the various epidemiology reports so she could combine them into a whole.
Right.
And it was shared with me at that point.
So by the end of October, you think you probably have seen this piece of work. Right, that's very helpful. We'll talk about the substance this afternoon. If we go back, look at your statement and go on to the next page. This seems to be you discussing Dr. Inkster sending you an email on the 10th of October asking for comments on the epidemiology reports available prior to working to combine them into a single document. Is that what effectively you're discussing, that moment when they all come together? And at that point, can we be sure that you, Dr. Peters, Dr. Harvey Wood are all aware of what each other's doing at that point, even if you weren't before?
Yes.
Right. Right. So could it be that your October 2018 report was only actually discussed at the 28th of September IMT and then not discussed at an IMT later that year? Have I got that right?
So what I would say was it wasn't even the report, it was a brief verbal presentation I gave where I described where I'd seen particular peaks and troughs in the positivity of the blood cultures. The report itself, I don't believe, was ever circulated to the IMT or discussed again.
Right. And of course, Dr. Harvey Wood and Dr. Peters thing, we don't see that was discussed either.
No.
And the HPS report hasn't turned up at this point.
No.
Now, just again, to keep ourselves grounded, these are all three pieces of descriptive epidemiology.
Yes.
Right. Now, if we go on to page 1, paragraph 91 of your statement, which is, I think, page 146. Now, this is discussing an IMT on the 30th of November 2018. So we see that at the bottom of the page. And what I wanted to understand here is that at this point, we're still waiting for if you go over the page, we see there we're still waiting for the HPS report. You haven't got it by this point.
Correct, yes.
Yes. Now I want to just pick up the narrative section. However, since the patients have been decanted from wards, there's been a marked reduction in bacteremia, which fits with the hypothesis. Dr. Inkster expressed as a result of this, that as a result of this, any future meetings discussed report may not be required. The decrease in bacteremia follow the decant does support the hypothesis and the chosen control of others, though it does not prove it. Now, I want to just expand on that with you. So we'll obviously deal with what the reports say this afternoon, but just from your point of view as an epidemiologist, what are the methods that one uses to intellectually structure the question, is there a link? How would you go about that as an epidemiologist, public health doctor?
So it's about combining evidence of different types from different sources, because all outbreak epidemiology, whether descriptive or analytical, is effectively observational. So you can never prove something the way you can, for example, in a randomized controlled trial when you're testing a drug,
Right.
which is interventional and prospective. So you need to.
Can you help us?
Yeah.
We want to make sure. What do you mean by interventional and prospective at this point?
So when you're testing a new drug, you have your study participants, you randomize them into two different groups. You give one the drug you're trialing, and you give the other group a placebo or the alternative current gold standard therapy, and you compare the two groups. And because of that study methodology, you have much stronger evidence to demonstrate causality, that it's your drug that's working.
Yes.
And that's because of that.
Because you control all the other differences.
Yes, and the randomization element effectively controls for the variables you've not thought of or that you can't control. And in studies like these, we're observing population groups where we don't have control over the exposures.
And you don't even have full knowledge.
No.
No.
So you do have to build up the evidence. And when you think things like, as I mentioned before, about the Cryptococcus, we've got the same organism in the patient and in a potential source locally in that tap. So that strengthens that association. So you always take the epidemiology and the microbiology and the environmental investigation as a whole. You don't take one piece of that. So here what we have is we've had a hypothesis that has been supported by both looking at the patient epidemiology. This is a particular group of patients with a particular vulnerability given their underlying diagnosis and their treatment. They're in a particular location in the hospital. At this point, although there are multiple organisms involved, there are some predominating. There are a series of positive samples like the water, demonstrating that the water supply isn't as wholesome as it should be. And then you put in the control measures, and you see the control measures have a positive impact. So the control measures match your hypothesis, which is another kind of string to the bow of the evidence that you're gathering.
Now, we've heard in a number of documents, including the report from Mr. Mukherjee, but also submissions from various core participants, and in responses to the case notes review from the Health Board, that there is a analytical approach known as from Professor Bradford Hill. Is that something you're familiar with?
Yes.
Yes. Now, merely as an aide-memoire, because he happens to have listed it, I'm going to put up Bundle 21, Volume 1, page 42 on the screen. And I'm going to encourage people not to look at the right-hand column because I don't want to get into the substance of what Mr. Mukherjee is saying. But he lists the Bradford Hill postulates, and I wonder if we can just walk through them and discuss them with you. So again, ignoring the right-hand column, because that's what he's doing in his report, we have just 3 columns: Index 1, Guideline, Explanation. And I wondered if you could help me about, firstly, are these postulates and guidelines that you would use in your work?
I wouldn't use them formally. I wouldn't sit in an IMT and go, well, we've got this one and this one and this one, but they are concepts that we train on in public health.
Right. So they're a sort of structure in your mind rather than a tick box.
Yes.
Right. To be fair to Mr. Mukherjee, he has set them out as a series of boxes. But the first one, the strength or degree of association, is that in some way about the numbers?
Yes.
So it's if you have more cases at a particular time, then that gives you a strength of association.
Not necessarily, because in the criteria, as you can see it laid out there, it's about the relative position between two groups. It's
Right.
not about the
Absolute Right.
numbers. It's about, well, this group have got lots more in the group who. So it might be helpful to think about them in the kind of context they were developed. If we go back to the studies around smoking and cancer, which
Right.
is where these were, well, people who smoked much more likely to get lung cancer than people who didn't smoke.
I see. And then consistency. Is this that you effectively, what Mr. Mukherjee has written down here, effectively that if you keep getting this association when the same thing happens, that's another factor?
Yes, or additionally to that, if you have different people doing similar studies on the same topic and they keep coming out with the same results.
Right. Now, specificity, have I understood that to be more that the absence of other explanations in a sense? In the context of going back to the cancer and
Yes.
smoking, there isn't another explanation for why this association would happen with this level of consistency, and therefore that's specific. Is that what we mean by
Yes.
specificity? Right. Okay. And then when we come to the next page, temporality seems to be to us lawyers obvious. It's happening at the same time.
Or the exposure happens before the outcome.
Yes.
Yes.
And a biological gradient is the worse things get, the more you get of the thing that's caused by that notion.
Yes. If you smoke 40 a day, your risk is greater than if you smoke 10 a day.
And then plausibility is a sort of scientific understanding of how it might happen if it was happening.
Yes.
So if you can't explain why all these things have happened, that's a problem.
Yes.
Right. Now, coherence. How would that work in the context of understanding an infection in a hospital? When would there be a discoherence between, if you have a putative microorganism, you find it in some patients, you find it you have these cases, when would you show a non-coherence?
So I think there's a good example of that in the statement in the minutes, and back to the descriptive epidemiology around the Stenotrophomonas cases.
Right.
That was just discussing. So epidemiologically, that seems like quite a strong association that these cases will be linked, given we use the phrase time, place, person.
Yeah.
So we had those particular individuals effectively mixing on the wards together, even if not directly. They were in rooms next to each
And
other.
they were
in at the same time.
Same taps and
They
that's
were using the same taps. At least two were in the room with the shower head where it was found. So that's a strong epidemiological association, and there's a strong basic microbiological association in that they all had the same organism. But then you have the issue of the typing.
This is the whole genome sequencing.
Prior to that, this was the typing came back as saying they were all unique. So this is
the bacteria involved in all these locations,
Yes.
all these patients were unique.
Yes, which is where you have a lack of coherence.
I see.
And then that gets you into the topic that I know is explored about how much does typing tell you in this sort
I
of...
want to do that this afternoon in substance, but it's useful to hook it in here so we know we're going to do it. And then experiment. Is this where you look at interventions and see whether they have an effect in the context of epidemiology?
Yes.
So if you put the filters on, for example, and you
Yes.
have reduction, if you affect chlorine dioxide, you have reduction.
Yes.
But of course, you can't often tell which is the one that's working and which are just nice.
Yeah, and that's a very well recognised issue in hospital infection control. That control measures are often done as bundles.
Because you do everything you can do.
Yes.
Right. And I think we've understood that at some point there's a dispute in 2019 about what part of the consequence is due to line safety improvements, what parts to do with hand cleansing, and what parts to do with water. Is that an example of this overlap of things
Yes.
being done? Right. And then the final one he lists is analogy. And I found that a little bit hard to understand. Next page, please. What would, in the context of a hospital epidemiology outbreaks, be analogy as a factor? What would we be looking at? Because you've been able to helpfully connect these things to our story.
Yes, so if I give the smoking example again
Yeah.
first. Smoking is very clearly associated with lung cancer, but it's also associated with other types of cancer as well in other parts of the body.
Right.
So because we've got the evidence on smoking and lung cancer, the analogy is, well, it may well cause
Something else.
similar problems in other organs. From a hospital perspective, I think the analogy would be other outbreaks occurring in other locations. Have other hospital locations dealt with outbreaks of a similar nature?
When you say other locations, you mean other hospitals?
Other hospitals, other
Yeah.
jurisdictions, not necessarily even in the
Yeah.
UK. Have they had similar things? How did they deal with them? What was the outcome?
So you might, for example, in our environment, be looking at the Northern Irish issues with taps,
Yes.
for example, as an analogy. Right.
Yes.
Right, that's very helpful. We'll take that off the screen. What I wanted to do was to ask you, just in terms of our approach to these things. So this is an inquiry that set itself the task of answering certain questions. One of which is, to what extent is there a link between the infections and the hospital environment? Do you see that form of analytical structure as something that we might consider using to work out our answer? And if you don't, why? And if you do, are there any pitfalls?
So I think it is a useful analytical structure. I suppose the principal pitfall is at this time and distance, how sure can we be about whether certain things happened at that? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think it does, because I mean, we've had great difficulty working out what's going on. Just watch you and me have a misunderstanding of it when the filters were fitted. So that would be the main thing, is just being sure what happened and when it happened.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's helpful. Now, what I want to do is go on to the bottom of page 146 of your statement. I just wanted to check something, which may be my misunderstanding again. Paragraph 94. So at this point, you're talking about the autumn, well, November of 2018. We've just been discussing when your October report, when you had the email exchange with Dr. Peters about all the epidemiology reports, and we looked at IMTs from then. And you say the IMT was still functioning at this time, although given the outstanding reports that were awaited, there were some loose ends that should have been pursued rather than dropped. I've got the impression from all the evidence that there were multiple IMTs. This particular one, the water incident IMT, did end in November. And that another IMT was set up, a brief one for a different infection. Then the Cryptococcus comes along, and then there's another one for gram-negative the following year. So when you say the IMT, do you mean the water incident IMT?
Yes, this sequence of IMT meetings. And I think that maybe explaining some of the things that could have gone better is because you have the February, March to May water, we have the summer water and drains, and then we have the subsequent IMTs in the September to November, and then the Cryptococcus, and then back to issues around gram negatives and potential environmental exposures in the summer of 2019. And they all kind of run into each other and bleed into each other a bit.
They do. It's quite hard to work out what's going on. Let's actually, before you go a bit further, just try and understand what's going on. So in that,
could I just really make sure that I've got the note of what Dr. Kennedy has said? We're using the definition of an IMT as an indication of potentially a series of meetings dealing with what is seen at the time to be a particular problem. And I'm right so far?
Yes.
Right. Now, you have given us a useful rundown of what you saw as the problems being dealt with in the IMT meetings in 2018 and 2019. Now, I really just want to take at dictation speed your listing. So you began with February, March 2018, and the problem, as you saw it, as you understood then, was?
That was the water supply issues. That was the
Right.
first one I was involved in, yeah.
So we can call that the water incident.
Yes.
You then mentioned summer water and drains.
And that was in the summer of 2018.
You then mentioned something which I missed.
And then you have effectively the IMT meetings continuing in the autumn of 2018. Again, this is about water and drains, and this is where the decant is ultimately agreed. And those meetings continue to the November.
Which is when we get this marked reduction in that, which is discussed at the top of the page that's been on the screen, right?
The next problem was Cryptococcus.
Cryptococcus, which was December to February 2019.
Which we're about to come to in a little.
And the final one was gram negatives.
The recurrence of gram negatives, which was summer and autumn 2019.
So
Thank you.
early on in the inquiry, I put to various of the HPS nurses that there hadn't been wrap-up debriefs at the end of IMTs. And I received, or the inquiry then received, copies of hot debriefs carried out by Dr. Inkster after some of the IMTs, not just the ones you're talking about, the ones beforehand. So it does seem there was a practice of, at least on many occasions, of carrying out what's called a hot debrief at the end of an IMT. Is that something you're aware of?
Yes, but before I come to that, could I just pick up a point from Lord Brodie around the definition of IMT?
Yes, of course.
Which might be quite helpful, because we often use IMT as a shorthand for the committee meetings being held by the incident management team. But they are two very closely related but separate things. The IMT is the multidisciplinary, multi-agency group you've brought together to deal with.
The team is more than just the meeting.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's an important point.
So
I think that's an important point to make. Thank you.
there seems to be some material that suggests that certainly up until the end of the water incident, it was the practice to do some relatively informal hot debriefs at the end of IMTs. Is that something you're aware of?
Yes, and that would be standard practice for any IMT. You do, it's almost a two-stage process. You do the hot debrief, which is fairly soon after the ending of an IMT, usually within a couple of weeks or a month or so. And that usually structured around the fairly standard 3-question, what went well, what didn't go so well, what can we do better next time? And that information is all gathered to catch any initial learning. And subsequent to that, there would then be a report of the IMT into the incident. And we are probably less good at doing that. And they can come in various forms. We have in the national guidance, the MPHI document, templates for a minimum data set of the...
And the MPHI is the public health version, as it were.
So it's the, I would say it's the senior document in terms of it's the Scottish Government guidance on how incident management should function when led by the NHS.
So you would see the National Inventory and Perfection Control Manual, Section 3, that deals with IMTs, as in some sort of structural way subordinated to that document. Or is that right? Am I going to get outrage from various people that you said that?
So what I would describe it is that Chapter 3 of the National Manual describes some of the basics of incident management, and in particular where incident management processes might be different for a hospital-related incident. The most obvious example being the required reporting and communication chains. Some of the definitions of an outbreak are slightly different, but it's not comprehensive. Whereas the MPHI document has a lot of additional information.
The MPHI document?
MPHI, which is short for the Management of Public Health Incidents by NHS-led incident management teams.
So that will make the person do the transcripts very happy. I suppose the question that, having worked out that there were the hot debriefs, I'll come back to whether substantive reports were done in a moment. There was, but I don't think you were at it, a late May 2018 debrief meeting from the water incident chaired by Dr. Emery from HPS. Were you aware of that happening?
Yes, I've certainly seen the record of that meeting if I wasn't present at it. Yeah.
And there seems to have been a report produced from that meeting. I wondered if you'd seen it. I'll see if I can get it on. It's listed in your documents. It's Bundle 27, Volume 5, Document 18, page 46. So this appears to be a report following that debrief in May 2018. Have you seen this before we put it in your bundle?
So I don't recall having seen it. I comment that in my statement that this is the sort of incident report I would expect to say. I don't recall having seen it, but it would be, in my view, normal practice for it to be sent to all IMT members. So I may well have received it, but
Well, I'll just ask you about, I think it may be a standard form document, because you see at the bottom of the page, after type of incident, and it reports environmental gram negatives and fungi from biofilm and bacteria, it then says main primary exposure food, which surprises everybody until you read go to the next page, and we see that water is highlighted. So it looks like it's a template. Would that be right, that this will be a template style document?
Yes, and it's very similar to, I mentioned the minimum data set included in MPHI. It's very similar to that.
Right. So we can take that off the screen, because obviously if it's not something you've seen, I won't put it to you in directly, but I get the impression from those who were involved in that debrief that it was quite a big exercise. And that was the end of May. That had been quite a big IMT from your point of view. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. And so could it be that one of the reasons why there weren't similar debriefs and reports later on that year is that, to some extent, the pressure of work on the IPC team, and particularly Dr. Inkster, was huge by November 2018? Would you
absolutely
accept that? And so, whilst would you agree that, or how would you react to the suggestion that, whilst it's good practice to do what you said, that's only really if there's the resource available to do it? Do the follow-up work. You only do the follow-up work if you've got the people and the time and the space in your head.
Yes, and that's something that both infection control and public health teams find fairly frequently, that doing that detailed follow-up, particularly full IMT reports, is something that is often overtaken by the next reactive issue that's coming in. I think I'm probably more referring to actions that have started in the IMT. For example, let's have epidemiology reports and look at them, not being closed off, rather than the subsequent reporting.
Right. So the point you'd like us to hear is that you feel that by the time we got to November, it would have been good if that comparison exercise that Dr. Peters had started had been finished, and that your report and Harvey Wood's report and the HPS report, whenever it turns up, will be looked at together and some thoughts, conclusions reached. Is that what you're effectively saying?
Yes, I think it was Dr. Inkster who was going to bring them together, but because as well as supporting the incident response, they can also be used to support the understanding of the antecedents of the incident. Why did this happen in the first place? And can we understand better what's going on in the hospital, even if it doesn't directly affect the decisions around the food control measures?
Now, it's quite a difficult question to ask you, but I want interested to see what the answer is. We've had evidence that throughout the period of 18, in fact before then, certainly back to the opening of the hospital and possibly before, relations within the infection prevention control team in NHS Glasgow in South Sector hadn't been as good as they could be, to keep it very high level. And that people are under pressure, people have resigned, there have been attempts to reorganize it and restructure it. How much were you aware of these cultural issues when you are taking part in this IMT in 2018?
At the IMT in 2018, not at all. I mean, that's not something that's being raised in the IMT.
So you're sort of actually coming in from outside, and you don't know the context, however toxic it might or might not be.
I had a very limited understanding of there were issues because I recall going to a infection control senior management team meeting when Anne Cruikshank has been brought in as the clinical director.
Yes, that was much earlier.
Yes, because of there were issues.
Right.
I didn't have any understanding of what those issues were, other than there were issues within the team, so a more senior medical manager had been brought in to support that team.
And by the time we get to these events, Anne Cruikshank no longer was in post. Her post had ended.
Yes.
Yes. How would you react to the suggestion that you're slightly coming at this from an idealist perspective? I'm now putting this entirely at a too exaggerated level to see what your reaction is, but you've come in from public health, where things happen, and I don't think they happen calmly at all, but things happen in a different way. You've arrived in the middle of what must have been a very, very busy year for infection prevention control, and now you've got all these suggestions of how it could be done better. And how would you react to the suggestion that you're not really getting the context at this point? Things are actually a little bit harder than you're giving them credit for. How would you react to that suggestion?
So I think it's absolutely fair to say, I didn't have that context. I'm not sure I would describe the suggestions of how to do things better as being idealist, because it's one of the aspects of public health practice is the recognition of we can't do everything in an ideal way. So some of the things that are suggested in terms of improvements of how IMTs could function are things that are more, I would say, common sense and routine best practice, things that we didn't previously have written into our local incident management plan because we just expect that to be what happens, whereas now we're stating it in black and white. And I think it's one of the keynotes of public health practice is pragmatism and proportionality. So, for example, if we're looking at control measures, there are often control measures suggested in guidance for a particular disease that we would do in an ideal world, but we just can't make happen, or the proportionality is not there. So I wouldn't describe it as being a kind of idealistic or attempt for perfection. No.
Now, what I want to do now is move on to Cryptococcus and page 148 of your statement. Now, your statement was produced, I think, before Dr. Peters produced her statement and before she gave evidence. And I wanted just to put two things to you about your interaction with her and the events in Cryptococcus. Now, one of them, I'm not sure actually when she came to give oral evidence, she quite went as far as she went in the statement. But she observed that she'd described it in her statement as detecting an undertone of casual sexism about her views and her experience. Now, to be fair, in that paragraph, it looked as if she could have been ascribing that to a number of people. And in evidence, she seemed to be ascribing it more to the estates people involved. But do you have any comment to make on that particular part of her statement, which was that particular observation by her?
Yes, and I did look back at the transcript of her evidence, and I think she's very clear. Her understanding matches my recollection, which is we didn't actually have any conversations of that nature at all between myself and Dr. Peters.
Well, that's helpful, so we can move on. The other bit was more a meeting that I think did happen, and I want to understand what you were doing when you were doing it. So there's a discussion in a number of people's statements who are present at Cryptococcus IMT that you were Googling information in the middle of the meeting about the size of Cryptococcus spores and the quality and effectiveness of filters. Now, you have a particular take on what you were looking for that isn't reflected in your statement because it predates you seeing that information. So what in that IMT were you looking for on your computer?
I certainly wasn't randomly Googling Cryptococcus. So as part of preparation for IMTs, particularly something like Cryptococcus, where our involvement is, or our experience is much less, I had been reading up on Cryptococcus. I've been looking at peer-reviewed journal articles summarising the nature of Cryptococcus and its presence in the healthcare environment. And I was trying to relocate one of those review articles because I thought it was relevant to the discussion that was ongoing. And because the discussions that are ongoing in an IMT like that, particularly if you're getting into things like air handling units and filter sizes, and can be fast-moving and can be confusing. So what I was trying to do was make sure I had the understanding of what was being discussed and checking whether actually what was being discussed matched with what my understanding from reading the background literature was.
What was being discussed at that point?
I think it was about whether or not the filters that were in place were suitable or effective enough to stop cryptococcal spores from entering the hospital.
So that's the filters that were in place at the time, not any potential filters that should or may have been fitted, right? And what was? Do you recollect what the debate was about at that point? Who took different positions, and what's the ultimate conclusion that the IMT reached?
I can't recall who took what positions or what was precisely said. There's an action in the minutes that says different filters were going to be sourced and fitted.
Right. So it may well be that the filters that were there weren't quite as good as they could have been, but you can't remember the details.
Yeah, I think that there's a comment in one of the minutes about. I can't remember the exact wording, but the gist of it is they're probably good against quite a lot of. They'll stop a lot of the spores, but aren't guaranteed to stop all of the spores getting through.
Well, I want to go to your report on Cryptococcus.
Yep.
Which is Bundle 24, Volume 3, Document 3, page 18. Now, this report is in your standard style, so it's easy to recognise.
Yes.
But this appears from your statement to be a report that you were asked to produce by Dr. Armstrong. Have I got that right, or am I misunderstanding there?
No, I think that was produced following discussion at the IMT, not at Dr. Armstrong's request, no.
Now, this report, you have some conclusions, and I wanted just to take through, firstly, when this is produced. So if we go to the end, so page 19, it's quite a short report. Next page. Yes, keep going to the end. I think I better get mine on my screen so I can give a page reference. Yeah, so we go to page
I think it's just been
page 20. So you have a summary at the bottom.
Yes.
So what I wanted is just check that we understand. So firstly, do you recollect exactly when this was produced?
So I've the version I've got has got a date at the bottom of the 10th of January 2019.
That's helpful because we didn't have a date. So this is quite early on in the Cryptococcus IMT's life, right? If we could look at that page, and I will just take from you a little bit more about these observations. So the first line, the statement that Cryptococcus species as a whole are rare, with only 19 cases over 10 years, is that in Glasgow?
Yes.
Yes. Now, we've obtained a report from a Mr. Bennett, which I haven't put to you, but he has obtained information from the reference laboratory, which suggests that the number of cases in the whole UK of Cryptococcus neoformans may be in the 30s. Would that be anything that would surprise you? So it's not a very large number, even across the whole UK annually, sort of 30 or so cases.
That would surprise 19 over 10 years. I'm just thinking of multiplying up.
But that's all Cryptococcus, remember, if you're that row, isn't it?
Yeah, and it would also only be those isolates that are forwarded onto the reference lab, and I don't know what proportion of.
Well, indeed, that's one thing to observe, but it's certainly rare. It's the main part, right? Now, you observed in the earlier part of the study period, the cases are dominated by patients with HIV, and the recent year it's mixed. And then the third, you talk about the highest number of cases clustered in the second half of the year, and the second item is 2010. And in 2018, it's the fifth bullet point, the cases were predominantly in patients with underlying hematological conditions. And then, as well as the 2 previous HIV cases, there were 5 cases attributable with hospital.
Healthcare associated infection.
Could you just explain the difference for us? Because it's an issue for various people.
Yeah, so hospital-acquired infection is assigned when the preponderance of evidence is that the infection has been caught in the hospital environment.
Is that because of a time control?
Mostly. So there are standard definitions used for surveillance of certain infections, particularly Staph aureus bacteremia, where there is routine surveillance and reporting from all hospitals in Scotland, and there is a very set definition of 48 hours.
So that's a hard Scottish definition for reporting purposes?
For those surveillance systems.
Yes.
And they are very useful for surveillance because you want to be precise about which infections fit in which.
And you want to be comparable as well?
Yes. Right. Yeah. When you're dealing with an outbreak, that might not necessarily be the most appropriate cutoff, but it's the starting point.
And so if it's not within the after 48 hours of arrival, then it becomes a healthcare associated infection. So effectively it's a binary choice, one or the other.
No, the third choice is community.
Community, right.
So healthcare associated infection is where there is, it doesn't meet the definition of a hospital acquired infection, but there has been some form of healthcare interaction recently that might cause a route of transmission. So the example I've given there is if you have blood taken within 30 days of your infection, that's counted as being healthcare associated because you've had a needle breaking the skin.
Yes.
And it might be that you have been discharged from hospital recently. So although you might have got it in the community, maybe you got it in hospital.
So before we come to Cryptococcus and how it affects them, just while we're talking about it, if you had...
Could I just check something? The distinction, I understand the distinction you've just drawn between an infection which is classified as possibly acquired because it's observed within 48 hours of inpatient admission to a hospital, as opposed to an infection which arises, I think you said, within 30 days of some health intervention.
Yes, and there are the additional items under that definition, but yes. That's...
Right. Now, just checking, where are you drawing that definition from? Because my recollection, which may be imperfect, is that the use of HAI and HCAI are not always maybe quite as clear-cut as you've just defined. So what's the document or source for your cutoff?
So in terms of the 48 hours cutoff, that's part of the, trying to find the right word, the kind of statement of process for national surveillance of certain infections.
So that's coming from the people who do the surveillance. We want you to report it this way.
That's coming from RHI. Yes.
Yes, right.
That's coming from RHI.
Yeah.
So I'm going to come back to an alternative definition in a moment. But what I want to do is just understand the practical consequence of this in a different patient cohort before we get to Cryptococcus.
Yes.
And we've obviously had a lot of evidence in this inquiry about the cancer journey of children and young people in the Shahani unit. And so we've heard how people will not only come in, children will come in for long resident stays and treatment as inpatients for many, many days, but also will come in to what's now Ward 2B and then go home, and then come in again and go home. So if someone is coming in as a day case, even though they might have been admitted to the hospital, but they don't stay overnight, they're never going to meet the 48-hour rule, are they? So there'll never be a HAI by the RHI definition.
Correct.
Right. But they will be potentially a healthcare associated infection.
And in fact, my understanding of the definitions is because they have the indwelling lines, they will always be an HCAI.
Yes.
Because they have that present, whether they have come in for a day case procedure recently or not, because they have the line in, that is sufficient to meet the definition.
So they're permanently in one category.
Yes.
Which most of the people in that category are going home and getting on with their lives. But these particular group of patients permanently sit in HCAI. They can never be HAI until they're admitted overnight and not for 48 hours, but they have a high level of contact with the hospital.
Yes.
Yes, right. And then when it comes to Cryptococcus, might there be another difficulty to do with the dormancy period of in the time it takes to come out and infect you? Have I got that right?
Yes.
So how would that, as it were, interact with the definitions?
So I think one of the big problems with the dormancy period is its variability.
It's for Cryptococcus.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we can only use the definitions we have in that sense, and it would be beyond the kind of public health competence to come up with different definitions specifically for Cryptococcus.
But the consequence is that you might have a patient who is exposed to Cryptococcus at home, maybe because they have pigeons, and they then come into hospital some months later, and their test is more than 48 hours after they arrive in the hospital. And certainly people might start thinking of them as a hospital-acquired infection, even though they're not. Have I got that?
Yeah, that's possible.
Possible. But equally, you might have a patient who has no association with any source of Cryptococcus, comes into the hospital, spends a few weeks there, goes home, gets on with what's going on in their life for a bit, then comes into hospital and gets a positive test. But they're not a hospital-acquired infection because it's been so long ago that they've actually been in a hospital.
Yes.
That, again, is a problem with that. And so you're telling us, don't start messing around with the national definitions because it'll confuse people, effectively, is your position. But the definitions of HAIs and HCIs.
No, what I'm saying is they're very useful if you're doing something like surveillance and you're looking for that comparability across time. When you have an outbreak situation, you might want to think more broadly.
Right.
And COVID is being considered elsewhere, but one of the things with COVID is we had definitions that we were using in terms of how long we asked people to stay at home for, which were actually slightly longer than the average incubation period for COVID.
Right.
Which in itself is 4 or 5 days longer than that 48-hour HAI rule.
So you were missing, potentially, in some senses, what might be a HAI.
Or potentially incorrectly attributing HAI to someone. Yeah.
So you're telling us that these are the important definitions for the purposes of surveillance, but you might need to be a bit more bespoke when you're doing analysis for a particular
Yes.
Right. Now, what I want to do is just, having looked at these summaries, I want to go back to the table, which is 2 pages back. Yes. Oh, sorry, page 19, please. Sorry. Now, very conscious that this is very bright and colourful, but the reason I want to show it to you is because I'd like to understand something and ask you a question. Now, if I understand it correctly, you're reporting that before 2014, the majority of patients are HIV patients.
Yes.
And there are quite a lot also of advanced liver disease patients, which I'm assuming what ALD is.
Alcoholic liver disease.
Alcoholic liver disease, sorry. And am I right in understanding that Cryptococcus is certainly rare, but a more common infection, or more frequently found infection, in those 2 patient groups than other patient groups? Is that something that we've understood correctly?
Yes.
Right. So, whilst individual infections are extremely bad for individual patients, there is something, as it were, non-surprising about seeing those green and red squares. Is that a fair way of understanding it? We then have 4 cases recorded in 2018 in blue, and these are hematology patients.
Yes.
Now, what do the asterisks mean?
So the asterisks are those who meet that standard surveillance definition of either HAI or HCAI.
Right. So you have 2 patients who do meet the definition. And in fact, these are unfortunately the patients who pass away in the latter part of 2018.
Yes.
Yes. And then we have 2 further patients who don't meet the definition of HAI.
And the blue hematology group, one who does, one who does not.
One doesn't. Right. And then we have another patient at the top who's not an hematology patient who does meet the definition.
Yes.
Now, am I right in thinking the reason they're all in the column is because they're all relevant to your work? You're just mentioning on the way past that some do and don't meet the definitions.
Yeah, so if we talk about the relevance of the work and the purpose of this type of report, so it does include the 2 patients who were subject to the investigation in the process of the IMT. But lots who don't. So this is a process called case finding.
Yes.
Which is part of the standard outbreak and incident management process. You do a step of case finding. And so what we're doing here is looking, are there any other, we know about these 2 patients. Are there any other relevant patients?
And this is you doing case finding, effectively?
Yes.
Right. The reason I thought that case finding was interesting was these cases, would they all be cases where there is a consensus that the patient actually did have Cryptococcus and not where there's a debate over whether they had Cryptococcus?
So these are patients who had a positive Cryptococcus blood culture result. So there isn't a clinical element added to that.
Okay. And why do you not add a clinical element?
It's about what data is available to us in public health and the time to complete. So what we've done is we identified the results, identified which patient that results to, and then reviewed the electronic notes.
So you can do this effectively without reading the notes. You're just looking at the high level, what blood tests they were having effectively.
No, we're looking at so we have an electronic medical record system. So we can see some of the notes made within patients. We can see any referral letters or test results and things like that.
Now there was eventually a Cryptococcus expert subgroup created following on from the IMT, and you weren't a member of that.
No.
It seems, since you did this work, why were you not a member of it? How did that come about?
I don't know how the membership of that group was agreed. I wouldn't necessarily see us as being an essential part of it, because I said all we're doing here is doing that case finding piece. And we were providing this to IMT to think, do you want to include any of these cases or not in your case definition and look at them as part of the IMT? And the reason you do case finding is because if you're missing cases, you don't have all the information about the outbreak.
Yes.
But given the clinical histories we could access about the other patients, and as I said, the 2 patients whose condition had prompted the IMT are included in this, they're on this chart. Having concluded that these patients weren't relevant for the IMT, there is no justification for doing any further work with them or looking at them in more depth.
Because the thing that intrigued me about the work of the Cryptococcus, have you read the Cryptococcus expert subgroup report?
Only in the bundle.
Only in the bundle. I won't put it to you for that reason, but I want to just draw out an observation that I've had to see what you'd make of it. It also does some patient finding. And it doesn't quite find the same patients, there's a slight difference. But it, broadly speaking, has the same shape of the table or the graph. Its report is finalized 2 years later in 2020, well, 4 years later in 2022, 3 years later. And I'd like to understand this patient finding concept with you, because there is a case which the inquiry is aware of in the summer of 2020, which involves a child who does have a positive blood test result for Cryptococcus neoformans, but is not assessed by the then lead infection control doctor as being a Cryptococcus case. There is a discussion about whether it is, and there's a disagreement between him and the treating clinician and the health board position is that it's not a Cryptococcus neoformans case. But it would meet your test in this patient finding exercise because it has a positive test and he was an inpatient in the hospital. When you're doing an analysis of the context of the cases you're investigating, so investigating the 2 cases in the hospital that we saw on the table where the patients unfortunately died, that's what they're investigating. Would it be relevant from your perspective to take account of a patient a year or so later who had a positive bloodstream BSI result for Cryptococcus, even though other people, including the lead infection control doctor, conclude that no, actually, it's not a Cryptococcus case? Would you still put it in the mix to have a think, or would you exclude it? How would you say best practice encourages you to go?
Yeah, so if we go stepwise,
Yeah.
first with the case finding, you've identified these cases, and in this case with this report, the view is they weren't relevant. If you thought, well, they might be relevant, that is then you get into the conversation about, is this a genuine case? What's the clinical picture? Do they meet our case definition?
So you'd have to have a case definition.
Which is effectively the step before. We often teach outbreak management as a 10-step process. And case finding step 4, case definition would be step 3. So a key part of any IMT's role is to agree the case definitions. To say, well,
so before you did this, would the IMT have agreed the case definition before you did this piece of work?
Yes, there should be a case definition recorded in the minutes.
Right. And, well, why don't we go look for it? Because I think it might be, well, we have a coffee break and I'll look for it. That's probably more efficient. I'll just see if there's a couple of questions I can pick up before we do this. Yes, I think the thing to do, my lord, is it might just we have a short break. I'll find that in a minute. Go a little bit early.
So take coffee break now.
Take the coffee break. I'll find them in. Otherwise, that might just take a bit of time, me charging around the screen and find them.
Right. Dr. Kennedy, could I ask you to be back for just checking? Well, let's say 11:45.
Certainly. Thank you.
Please stand.
Mr. McIntosh.
Yes. So what it was, Dr. Kennedy, before we broke for the coffee break, is that you'd mentioned that your report would have come at a stage after a case definition would have been produced for investigating the potential incident. And we thought we might find a copy of the case definition in the IMT minutes. Now, I haven't found it, but I found something that might be similar. So I thought I'd take you to Bundle 1, page 288. Which is in a minute. If we go back to page 286, it's a meeting of the 24th of January. So this is the 8th meeting of the IMT. And if we go to page 288, we have a microbiology report section, which doesn't seem to report your actions. But there might be something on the next page. No, it's not there. If we go back to 248, perhaps, we'll try that instead. So this, if we go back to the previous page, right before that, 245, here we are, 20th of December. So we start off the meeting. It probably wasn't then. If your report's dated January, we should probably be looking at the IMT minutes after your report. So I think we should go and look at the IMT of the 17th of January, which is document 59, page 266. And so this is a meeting at which you're at in the morning. It's a long meeting, the 17th of January. Do you remember how long these meetings were?
Yes, I think there might have we might have reconvened later in the day that day.
You did?
Yeah.
And so the section that I wanted to look at is this meeting follows your date of the report. And we don't have at this meeting any discussion of you doing a report or producing a report, and there's not one of the afternoon meeting either. But there is something on the one the day before, on the 16th of January, which is on page 261. You see current risk to patients at the bottom there? And Dr. Inkster had contacted Bristol, and the discussion of the strain had only been seen once in NHS Greater Glasgow. Do you see your mention there?
Yes.
Now, what I'm beginning to suspect from my sort of flailing around these minutes is there isn't a happy paragraph that says the case definition is X. How sure are you that there was a discussion of the case definition in early 2019?
I'm not. I think before the break I was talking what the best practice would be.
Right, okay. So
to explain why, what the process of the IMT considering the outputs of the report I produced would be, that if any of them had been considered relevant, a case definition should be applied.
because there's also not in these minutes any discussion of your report either.
I think there should be in one of the meetings. So the meeting that I didn't attend, but Hilda Cruikshanks, one of my nurse specialists, did attend, which might have been this time.
I think what I will do with that, I'll leave this now.
Yeah.
You've got bundle 1 on your computer, I understand.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to set you some lunch homework to find this entry because I can't find it. But we'll move on. I want to turn to something in Dr. Walker's report for the inquiry, which is Bundle 21, Volume 1, Document 5, page 180. So this is the report, and I want to go to page 251. And you see at 5.51, Dr. Walker's given the definition of a healthcare-associated infection is a problem which develops as a direct result of healthcare interventions, for example, medical or surgical treatment, or as a direct contact with a healthcare setting. Now, he references that to NICE. I wonder how you feel about that as a definition of HAI.
So I think that's a definition of HCAI.
Right.
Because we would use the initialism HI to refer specifically to hospital acquired.
Yes, well, this is hospital associated.
Yeah, or healthcare associated. So what we would refer to as HCAI.
Yes. So he's taken his abbreviation in a different way.
Yes.
And we'll ask him whether we should read HAI throughout his report by that definition. Take that off the screen. What I want to do now is to go to paragraph 141 of your statement, page 160, which is discussion of Microbacterium chelonae. Now, actually, it starts the previous page, paragraph 140, and you discuss the minutes of the 25th of June 2019 IMT meeting. And over the page, and there are of the 6 cases, 2 were hospital-acquired infections, and other 4 were healthcare-associated infections. 2 cases of Microbacterium chelonae in the past 12 months. The last case had been a blood culture taken in May 2018, and most recent a sample in May 2019. Now, I understand you might have produced a briefing document on this for Dr. Armstrong.
So I produced a briefing document for Dr. Armstrong on atypical mycobacteria generally. I didn't produce a briefing document on these cases or the specific incident.
Okay, well, we can find the email about this.
I think I reference it in another paragraph in my statement.
You do, and I'm trying to put the two in together. Yeah. So if we look at Bundle 14, Volume 2, page 562, and they go to the next page, and keep going past the next page, we get to the start of it. So 13th of August 2019, so it's a bit later on, you seem to be sending to a group of people a briefing note on a non-tuberculosis mycobacteria briefing note, and you're asking for comments. Now, we don't have the note, so all we have is the comments, which is the next page. We have a long email from Dr. Inkster yeah, that's the one, yes. And that's her take on matters. Now, the reason I wondered whether this report might have discussed actual cases is because Dr. Inkster's comments discuss actual cases. So would your report have discussed the actual experience of the hospital for atypical mycobacteria in recent times? The briefing note, sorry.
I don't recall it doing that. It would be more general. I'm sure I could find a copy for the inquiry if that would be helpful.
I think it might be helpful. The reason is that Dr. Inkster believes that there was a proposal to somehow remove from that report references to Microbacterium chelonae. And now I'll ask her next week about how that came about and how she knows it, but we haven't got a copy of the report, so it makes us slightly less efficient.
So I think when Dr. Inkster is referring to removing mentions of the specific organism from a report, that's not referring to the briefing note I did for Dr. Armstrong, but for the HAIRT, the routine infection control report that goes to the public boards meeting.
I see, right, that makes more sense, in fact. Then don't produce the briefing note. So, what's your take on these events that she's describing?
So it had been a meeting of the Board Infection Control Committee. The Dr. Armstrong was chairing.
We can take this off the screen.
There's always a discussion about the report to the board, the HAIRT, at BICC. It goes through that as part of the governance chain. And Dr. Armstrong asked for a background note for her personal use in case she got asked any questions about atypical mycobacteria by board members.
Right.
Not specifically about the outbreak.
Right. And that's the briefing note that you produced.
And that's the briefing note that I produced. Carol Doctingster wasn't at that meeting of BICC.
So that would have been in August 2019?
Yes.
Early August 2019?
Yes, I believe my recollection was that she'd initially given apologies for lateness because she was attending a meeting about the rebuild of 2A that was running on. So I prepared that.
Could it have been at the end of July, like 29th of July? Would that be a possibility?
Yes.
Because you're there and she's not.
Yeah.
Right.
And we do have some experience of Microbacterium in public health. We look after the TB liaison service. We'd handled some atypical Microbacterium situations. It's a literature review. It's something well within kind of the competence of the public health team to develop that report. I'm sure it's equally in the competence of the microbiology team to do it. But it had been tasked to me by Dr. Armstrong. But I wanted to make sure that I had gotten all the relevant information and feedback before it went to Dr. Armstrong, hence sending it to that small group of people who were relevant. So it's Dr. Inkster, Sandra Devine and Tom Steele who asked for their feedback. You've got the email there of Teresa's feedback, where I think she does misinterpret the purpose or misunderstand the purpose of what Dr. Armstrong has asked for. She hasn't asked for a report on the incident. Dr. Inkster does provide some very helpful comments and additional references, which I then incorporate. And that's the briefing note that then went to Dr. Armstrong.
So effectively what we have is potentially someone who's not at the meeting receives your briefing note, thinks it's something else and wants to add more stuff to it.
Yes.
Right. Now, you mentioned that there might have been discussion at the meeting on the 29th of July, I got that right, of 19, of changing the report to the public board. Or was that
I don't know if it was discussed at that meeting, but I know about it because it's mentioned in the email trail. I don't remember it specifically, but there were having discussions about, particularly if you're talking about single cases, how appropriate it is of how much information should go into the public domain in case it makes those individuals identifiable.
Well, because that is one of these problems with well, it's a problem for us as well as it is for the board. I think presumably you'd agree with that the Microbacterium chelonae cases are somewhat troubling at the time. They've happened twice in 12 months. There's been a lot of meetings and discussions, none of which, not which you're all involved in. It's a matter of some public notoriety at the time. There is great concern. In the world of unusual microorganisms, how does a health board successfully brief its non-executive board members and sort of do its governance work when discussing individual microorganisms where you almost certainly will be identifying a patient because there's only one case, only two cases? How do you get around that governance problem of being well governed and informing your board whilst at the same time not exposing individual patients to unwelcome attention?
So there's a couple of, there's making the individual decision what the appropriate balance is. So, for example, although the organism wasn't named, the case was still included in the public report. Mm-hmm. But also, you can do things like have the board meet in private.
Right.
So not include the information in the public report, have the board meet in private and brief them. And I know that's certainly done at least once.
So are you, I mean, stop me when I say things you don't know about because it's possible. Are you aware of whether it's possible that there was an earlier case of Microbacterium chelonae in the very early months of 2016? Now, I gave you a reference to a page in Dr. Mumford's report. Did you find the footnote that I pointed you towards? No. Well, then let's take you to it because I think it's only fair to show you the document. So if we could go to Bundle 21, Volume 1, page 139. Now, this is a section from Dr. Mumford's report. And the second bullet point, the one that gives there were further 19 cases. And in the third line, and including one case of Microbacterium chelonae in 2016, footnote 95, and the footnote 95 is the blood culture samples data set that we've been given as an inquiry. So, take that off the screen. When you are involved in these discussions about Microbacterium chelonae in 2019, did you have any awareness there might have been a 2016 case?
No.
No. Do you have anything you feel you can contribute to the question of how can a hospital infection prevention control team spot? What's the best way of spotting unusual microorganisms? Because it's so easy to spot ones that are on the national list. You can have a flag on the computer, and Mr. Walsh has a system. How do you spot unusual ones?
So what you're trying to do is identify things that don't come up in routine practice, and that is where professional judgment of senior clinical staff comes in.
Ultimately, that means microbiologists.
Microbiologists and the clinical team looking after the patient.
Yes.
And that's a dialogue between them.
Right. So that's the only way to do it?
Yes.
Right. Well, what I want to do now is to move on to paragraph 142 of your statement. So where you say, at the time you've been to have concerns about the functions of the IMT, and it goes beyond what you describe as the minor sufficiency you mentioned earlier in regarding the 2018 IMTs. The IMTs were losing focus and direction, and interaction with the IMT was becoming strained. Why, in your view at the time, as someone who was there, were the interactions becoming strained?
It was to do with I suppose a combination of process issues. If we come back to, for example, the concept of case definition, there was a case definition, but it was very broad. And we had a number of different microorganisms in different patients. And this comes back to the point about all the IMTs bleeding into each other, so that we were starting to jump back to, well, the control measures you put in place aren't working, when we didn't necessarily have evidence that that was the case. But
just on that issue, yeah. I mean, we're now in summer 2019. I think we're in August. It's not rational to look back at what happened in 2018 and the chlorine dioxide and the filters and the third filter system in the basement plant rooms and think about those as issues. That surely one would do that and look at what happened the year before.
Yes, but what you shouldn't do is assume that that's the same problem recurring until you've done that looking. And my recollection at the time is the filters were in place, the chlorine dioxide was in place, the water sampling was good. We weren't finding things in the water supply. So if there is an environmental source, it's a different one, or it might be more than one. And this is where you start getting to conversations about these cases, which are all definitely cases of infection that needs investigated. Do they together as a cluster constitute an outbreak with a source we can identify and control, or are there more than one thing going on here? So I think one of the things that it was coming back where some of that strain was coming, thinking was asking that question was challenged back with a, so you don't think there's any problem? Which was never a position I stated or held. So not say that there's nothing going on here, but it's saying, are we being too narrow in our focus because of our experience of 2018? Should we be looking more broadly? I mean, and that was the point I think Mr. Taylor of being so, well, you're not keeping an open mind. Say, well, what other? Let's not assume it's only this. Let's look more broadly. Let's take into account all the evidence we can gather.
Because I understand that. The first question, I suppose, is that sounds like a discussion between you and Dr. Inkster, i.e. people who are knowledgeable and understanding of public health and infection control and epidemiology. Am I right to see it as a conversation amongst people who can talk epidemiology, and is that the right way to see it?
Yes, occurring in the IMT.
In the IMT. And at that stage, is this strain, and I recognize it's not the strongest word, extending out to people who are coming in from, say, estates or from senior management, or is it really at this level being conducted between you and Dr. Inkster and some of the microbiologists and nurses who are all present?
I think there was strain or other, you know, negative interaction between microbiology and estates was visible earlier in terms of interpersonal reactions or things like that. I just was in the conversations with Peter Hoffman and whether who should be in the room, should it be both microbiology and estates or should it be just estates?
Yes, because there seems to be some sort of view that one shouldn't go off and talk to Mr. Hoffman without estates being present. Seems to be a view that.
Well, that had been agreed as an action at the IMT that there would be, because I think Dr. Inkster had spoken to Peter Hoffman and there was then going to be another conversation with both microbiology and estates present.
And that didn't happen.
And that didn't happen.
Right. We've got this sort of tension. And before we go on to what then happens, I want to just press you on, because over the summer, or the early part of that IMT, one gets the impression from all the papers that there might have been multiple potential hypotheses out there. So there was a, is it the same thing as last year conversation? Was that something that was being discussed at the IMT?
Yes.
Yeah. A sort of extended and more exaggerated version in a new setting of the drains problem from the previous autumn?
Yes.
Yeah. Something around about chill beams and dust?
Beams, yes.
Something around about chill beams and leaks from the chill beams?
I can't recall if leaks had been risen at that point or not. They may have been.
Yeah. Discussion about the physical quality of the fabric of Ward 6A?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm assuming by this point the CLABSI work had happened and there wasn't any particular anxiety about line health at this point.
So that was an ongoing process. It's
And
continuous.
then hand hygiene and that sort of stuff, that was a possibility as well?
Yes, and there were kind of observed practice sessions by the infection control nurses going on the ward and
watching clinicians in action. And then there always be the question of, could it be that it's being brought in from outside by patients or families and visitors, and that's an issue possibly as well.
Yes.
Right. So I appreciate that there is a sort of clarity of the way you're putting it, that one has to have an open mind and look at all these options and not just go back to the previous year. But given how difficult the previous year had been for the patients, for the clinicians, for everyone else involved, is it not understandable that people would look back and go, oh gosh, did it not work, as a thought process?
Yes, I think that's reasonable, but when you looked at things like the environmental sampling, the water sampling, for example, we weren't seeing the same problematic results as we saw in 2018 prior to the control measures being put in place.
But you were seeing some. I mean, there were Microbacterium chelonae being found inside the filters. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And there was some gram-negative, just not as much.
I think very few, but
Very few. So let's move on to what happens, because you described in your statement on page 162 a meeting that took place on the 20th of August 2019. I want to look into this in somewhat more detail. Can I show you Bundle 14, Volume 2, Document 144, page 568? So this appears to be, well, what is this? Did you get this email on the 16th of August?
I did, yes.
Yeah. So what is it?
Oh, it's an invitation to meeting to discuss the IMT.
Well, it doesn't say that, does it?
No, but I would have read it from the context of I had earlier conversations with Professor Decant about the IMT performance, and she was going to take this action to bring people together to discuss.
So this wasn't a surprise to you?
No.
No. But it's not actually a meeting that tells you we're going to have a meeting to discuss the IMT. I'm not quite sure why we've removed all the letters T and I from the document, but no doubt there's a reason for that. But if we insert the letter TI whenever there's a space in the middle of words like meeting, it reads like a number of issues regarding hemato-oncology unit. Now, firstly, does the invitation list contain any clinicians working in the hemato-oncology unit?
No.
No. Apart from Dr. Inkster, it contains Dr. Inkster, it contains Mr. Vine. Mr. Walsh, by this point, has moved on to other posts. So it doesn't invite the people from HPS or RHI?
No.
No. You, of course, knew what this meeting was going to be about. You're nodding.
Yes.
Yeah. But would you accept that it might well be that Dr. Inkster didn't know what this meeting was going to be about? If she got this email?
Yes.
Yes. And can you tell me, I mean, I'm sure I can ask Dr. De Kestiger when I get to her next week, but we have next, but why is this restriction, why are all the members of the incident management team not invited?
I don't know.
Because you were quite keen for us to understand an IMT as a group of people, as well as a meeting. If you're discussing an IMT, surely you want to speak, maybe not at one meeting, I appreciate that, to all members of the IMT. Would that not make sense?
Not necessarily everyone who attends an IMT, but certainly those key individuals representing the agencies, for example. It would make sense for Professor Castor to have spoken to Professor Gibson, for example.
It would make sense, and we'll ask her whether she did that.
Yeah.
But the main thing I'm concerned about at this stage is that there are people on this meeting, and I wondered why they're in the IMT. So given me, you've said that the IMT is a team, working from the bottom upwards from the list, alphabetically I think it is. Professor Steele, very senior board member, Director of Estates.
Yeah.
How is it that a Director of Estates ends up part of the IMT, the team? How does that work?
When you're bringing together the membership of the IMT, what you're looking for are decision makers. You need people who are able to commit on behalf of their agency or their department to carry forward the agreed actions of the IMT. What you don't want in an IMT is being in a position where the IMT makes a recommendation, but that recommendation hasn't involved any discussion with the people who can then make that happen. So in larger, more complex incidents, you would anticipate having more senior individuals from the organisation present.
Because that's sort of what happened in September 2018, isn't it? That the IMT decided we should probably have a decant.
Yeah.
And then over that weekend, we discussed early this morning on the 14th and 17th and 18th of September, a different group of people, the executive review group, Water Executive Review Group, I think, decided to approve the decision. So you would see the inclusion of people like Professor Steele in the IMT as a means of ensuring that it's effective.
Yes.
Right. Now, returning to this meeting, if this had been a meeting about meeting an IMT that you were chairing, and you had received this email without the pre-briefing from Dr. De Kestiger, how would you feel if you turned up at that meeting to discover it was about your IMT and the way it was being run?
It would be a difficult meeting. It would be challenging. It would be, but I wouldn't think, given the place the IMT had gotten to this situation, I wouldn't find it surprising if those issues were raised.
I appreciate that it wouldn't be surprising, but would it be fair to effectively invite someone to a meeting, an invitation that doesn't mention the topic, to then discuss what's gone wrong with their IMT with no notice? Is that fair?
No, I think it would have been better if it had been more explicit that the meeting had been called because of concerns of IMT performance that had been raised to Professor Decaster.
Would it, given the sort of obligation on doctors to treat their colleagues with respect, does it treat Dr. Inkster with respect to invite her to a meeting that's going to discuss what she's doing wrong, in the eyes of some people, and how she might be replaced without giving her notice?
Oh, I think it would have been appropriate to give more information in that email.
Right. Let's look at the minute itself, which is bundle 6, document 22, page 70. Uh, 70. So, firstly, you remember the meeting?
Yes.
Yes, and you are recorded as being present. There are 10 other people there, plus Mr. Forrester, who's obviously from administration. Now, I get the impression from this that 6 of you have been at the IMT, either at the previous meeting or the one before that. And that would be Dr. Degan, you've been at the meeting. He's been at the meeting in the past.
Yes.
And Tom Steele's been at the meeting.
Yes.
Mr. Redfern's been at the meeting.
Yes.
And you've been at the meeting.
Yes.
And Mr. Vine's been at the meeting.
Yes.
And Ms. Rogers has been at the meeting.
Yes.
And I think even Dr. Mathers has been at the meeting, but not recently.
Correct.
Right. Now, had Dr. Green, Mr. Best, and Dr. Maguire ever attended the IMT?
Not to my recollection.
Right.
I mean, they may have done, but...
And Dr. Inkster's apologies are recorded.
Yes.
Now, her position is she was actually off sick at this point.
Yes.
So I want to just clear that in the first paragraph of the meeting, it's clear that meeting was about the IMT that was running for gram-negative bacteria in Ward 6A. There's no doubt in your mind it was about any other IMT.
Correct.
Right. We can go back to your statement, please, at page 153, where you've explained that Dr. Inkster's off sick. 164, sorry. And you described that there was confusion at the next IMT.
Yes.
Were the people who were confused at the next IMT on the 20th of August present at the meeting on the 20th of August?
Yeah, I think some of them were.
So who do you think at the meeting of the 23rd of August was confused? Or had confusion? Because you said there was confusion.
Well, I think there was confusion because Dr. Crichton had been asked. And I've actually, since preparing the statement, found a further email which I was copied into where she was asked.
Right.
So I know she was asked by Dr. Decaster on the Thursday night, the evening before.
That's what she says in her statement,
Yeah.
yes.
And just says, we need someone from public health to chair this meeting. And that doesn't say because Dr. Inkster is no longer the chair.
It doesn't give a reason.
It doesn't give a reason. And my understanding from the previous meeting on the 20th had been that this would be a discussion with Dr. Inkster about what happens next.
But there wasn't discussion, as far as we can tell.
I believe Sandra Devine was trying to have those discussions.
But what I mean is
her
when you get to
understanding
the
was-
meeting, it becomes apparent that there hasn't been discussion. Yeah.
Correct.
And so the question I'm trying to work out is that we've got you describing at the meeting there's some confusion.
Yeah.
And we've got the minute of the meeting on the 20th of August, if we go back to that in bundle 6, has a subset of the IMT's membership there. And what you're going to end up with, I would suggest to you, which is probably inevitable, is that all these people are going to have this conversation, which is minuted over the next 3 pages, in some detail about what should happen. They're going to turn up at the IMT, and however much briefing or emails or phone calls are done, they're going to be people at IMT who have no idea what's going on. Would that be an inevitability of this process?
Yes.
Yes. Why were the views... There's no discussion in this minute, and I can ask other people who are present, and I will, is was there any discussion at this meeting about obtaining the views of everyone else on the IMT, or was it just going to be the views of these people that mattered?
And there was certainly discussion on getting Dr. Inkster's views.
Well, apart from that,
Not that I recall.
no. Okay, so no discussion of getting clinicians' views, for example. No discussion of getting the clinicians' views.
Not that I recall, no.
All right. Okay, if we can go back to your statement, please. Page 165. So you've given your views on these events, and in paragraph 156 up, which stay on this page. At the top of the page, you recall having a discussion about how Dr. Inkster didn't want to relinquish the role. You see the 4 lines down from the top?
Yes.
Dr. Inkster would put it that she did in fact attempt to demit the chair in September 2018. Were you aware of that?
No.
Now, and it's minuted, I think, in a minute of a meeting you weren't at. So you weren't aware of that?
No.
No, okay. Let's go to the IMT, the 23rd of August. So that's Bundle 1, Document 78, page 348. Now, was there a pre-meeting before this meeting in the room involving certain people who end up at the IMT?
Yes.
Yeah, and were you in that meeting?
Yes.
Who else was there?
Dr. Crichton, Dr. Degan, Sandra Devine, I recall being there. There were others, can't recall exactly.
What was the purpose of the pre-meeting?
So my understanding of the purpose was to get Dr. Crichton up to speed. We had a new chair in, she hadn't been involved previously. There was a lot of background, a lot of detail to get through.
Given that there were some tensions, the meeting had become strained before this.
Yes.
Do you think having a pre-meeting in the room beforehand is going to help reduce the level of strain?
No, and I think particularly as it ran on, I certainly felt increasingly uncomfortable that we had senior staff standing outside the room, not doing their day job, waiting to get in.
Yes, from Professor Gibson downwards.
Yes.
Now, if we go back to Bundle 6, page 70, and this is the minute again of the 20th of August, and we go to page 71, do you see how the third action is there should be a pre-meeting for very complex ITs, especially the results or reports available that has not been circulated to the whole IMT, to allow key members to review this prior to the meeting. This would enable a transparent review of all the information and a proper risk assessment to discuss at the full meeting. Firstly, do you remember that being discussed on the 20th of August? The idea of having a pre-meeting in the future?
I don't.
No. Do you think that idea of having a pre-meeting involving key members, whoever they are, is consistent with the team approach of running IMTs set out in the various manuals and guidance on how to do so?
It's certainly within practice to, particularly in complex IMTs, have subgroups or other groups, other teams meetings. So you might, for example, have an epidemiology group, or you might have a technical group, or you might have a food investigation group who will go away and look at things like the results or what's taken action, and then report back. So it's certainly well within the bounds of normal IMT practice that not everything gets discussed at the full meeting.
And indeed, we had that with the water technical group in 2018.
Yes.
Yes, right.
As I said, I don't recall the discussion, but my interpretation of that action 3 is about dealing with one of the issues that was coming up was we were often getting results very late. And in effect, it was Teresa would have had written notes from the lab, and that's the only way we would ever get results or see those results. They wouldn't have been collated, investigated, circulated beforehand. my interpretation of that paragraph is perhaps trying to do that curation and contextualization of the information that was coming into the IMT, so the IMT is better prepared. It's one of the things I mentioned in my statement is one of the errors incident management teams can make is trying to do the investigation in the IMT meeting itself, whereas what you should be doing is looking at the results of the investigation and considering through the implications of that.
So going back to my sort of challenge earlier about your criticisms, potentially my word, not anyone else's, of being idealist. To what extent did you have any knowledge at that time of the pressures in terms of work pressure, in terms of amount of work on Dr. Inkster in the early part of 2019? That she had, for example, a request to bring in 2 additional sessions a week in February approved, although it didn't happen. Were you aware of that?
I wouldn't have been aware of that.
No.
I would have been aware of until having myself chaired complex IMTs of the amount of work and pressures simply the IMT puts on you. But I wouldn't be aware of any broader workforce or work planning issues.
No, and I'm wondering whether there's a difference between public health IMTs and hospital IMTs from the point of view of the chair. And I'll go with this for a bit and see what you think of it. In a hospital public health IMT, the chair is possibly an infection control doctor who might be doing some sessions of infection control, but also a consultant microbiologist and has a caseload to do as well. And that's
Yes.
You understand that? And in public health, without wishing to minimise the pressure on a small and probably overworked specialism, public health is your only job. Have I got that right?
Yes.
But is it not a different thing?
But,
But do expand the but.
Yeah, absolutely. The reactive work, the running incident management teams, is only a small part of that public health job. So whilst all the work we do is public health, and I'd say more broadly that the outbreak investigation and running incident management teams is a core function and a requirement of all public health consultants working in territorial boards. Maybe not overgeneralise that, but most of us, rather than would draw a distinction there with infection control doctors where it is more limited and isn't necessarily part of every microbiologist's role.
Yes. And so I'm just wondering to some extent whether this observation at Paxton 3, but the general sort of tone of the anxieties about these IMTs might be partly grounded in a lack of realization of the limited resource available from ultimately Dr. Inkster and previously other IMT chairs to do this job, and therefore actually doing it on the hoof with bits of paper from the lab is the only way to do it because there's no other system.
I think there is a couple of additions I would make. The first is it's absolutely standard practice and good practice in IMTs, and we do see this in August 2019 of having a second consultant from the same specialty as the chair to attend the IMT. To in fact split that role, so you have one person, whether it's a public health consultant or a microbiologist in the hospital, leading the IMT, doing that, and it goes beyond just chairing a meeting, although that's a large part of it. It's the whole coordination of response, and then having a second specialist from the same field who's there to deliver the specialist advice. So the chair isn't doing both of those roles.
That would rather require there to be such doctors available.
Yes,
yes.
But that would be good practice. And the other point was in terms of pre-meets, again, thinking around the incident management team. Again, slightly different roles in a hospital outbreak, but when we think about a community outbreak, we have a core team of the public health consultant, the senior environmental health officer, and then usually a microbiologist or maybe a toxicologist, whoever is a specialist in the field of the relevant pathogen, as kind of the core. And we will often have between meeting conversations or email exchanges or sharing evidence and documentation in terms of doing a lot of the work that is needed to make the IMT function. So you'd have the core team and then other participants who are relevant within the meetings or taking actions between the meetings or sitting on subgroups. And it is, and I think there's a point which perhaps you get to that, not that we have more resource available on a day-to-day basis, but in public health we are probably more willing or able or accepted to redirect resource when we're dealing with complex investigations. So
your activities are more unusual from the point of view of the people who are dealing with. It's a surprise when you turn up.
Yes.
Which it isn't a surprise when there's an IMT in this hospital 4 years after opening, is it? No.
So if I can give a very small example, which I mentioned, it was sometimes there were issues of getting a room to hold an IMT meeting in during 2018, 2019.
The thing
from a public health perspective, I would have chucked the other people out of the room. I would have.
Yes,
that's how we would have dealt with it.
I suppose one thing to say about that idea of having the people involved in running the IMT meeting beforehand just to work out what's going on. I didn't read, and that way you agree with me, that paragraph, action 3 on page 71, bundle 6, as about those people, that is maybe the IMT chair, the lead infection control nurse, someone from microbiology, the clinician. I read it as the people coming from the executive. Now, am I being unfair to see the key people in that paragraph in the context of the whole meeting and the way it's been set up? Is that's not the people who normally run a quiet non-notorious IMT. It's the deputy medical director, it's the head of estate, it's the senior people. Am I being unfair to read that in there?
I wouldn't read it that way, no.
How would you read it? Who are the key people in this context?
I think the people who are, I think as you laid out in the hospital IMT, it would be the IMT chair, it would be the lead ICN. If there was, it might be the general manager for that hospital area who would have day-to-day operational responsibilities.
It's rapidly becoming the IMT though, isn't it?
But a smaller, a subset of the IMT, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's move on to, back to your statement, to page 166, where you have a section from paragraph 160 of late 2019 IMTs. Now, I want to take this relatively quickly without referring to too many documents, because you discuss the IMTs that happen after, as it were, Dr. Crichton's taken the chair.
Yes.
And you've given your particular take on the various events. And all I really wanted to ask you was this, do you consider there was a change of approach in the IMT after the change of chair?
Yes, I think it's that point on focus, which was, well, precisely where are we, what are our hypotheses, what actions have we taken to stop them, what point do we need to get to be in a position to stand down the incident response. And I think that was Dr. Crichton's focus was there is an objective to the IMT. The IMT is not just about reactively managing the new things that come up. It's about getting in this case, the hospital, the service, back to a position where it moves back to a business as usual position as best as they can when they're not in their normal ward.
Because we've had evidence in the Glasgow 2 hearing from a number of clinicians who attended these IMTs. And I'll go through what their evidence is in some detail, but the broad brush of it is that there was a change in methodological approach, but the change was previously the IMT had sought an explanation for what was seen as unusual pattern of infections. But after the change of chair, the clinicians felt the emphasis was on disproving the validity of the underlying suspicion. In essence, they felt that that an unusual pattern had to be positively proved to exist before it could be investigated. Now, we've got some evidence from some of those. I'll come to that. In broad terms, how would you react to that sort of summary by me of what the evidence said?
It wouldn't be my characterization of it at all, no. And I think this is one of the areas where there is, where there was dispute, and I mentioned in my statement about it being insisted that I didn't believe there was any infections, was the phrase used by one of the clinicians.
Yes.
And I think that's an unfair characterisation of what I was trying to say, what others were trying to say, which is we have a number of infections. They are gram-negative infections. They are infections that are rare. They're infections that it's entirely understandable that many of the consultants hadn't seen before, because you might only see one every 3 or 5 years of this particular infection. And that doesn't mean they're not valid to investigate. And I think there was a couple of, perhaps we'll catch up on using the term outbreak or declaring it as an outbreak as a kind of shibboleth almost, in terms of, well, if you don't want to treat it as an outbreak, then you must think everything's fine. Whereas, you look at, for example, these cases may come from different issues. Because more than one hypothesis could be true. Perhaps someone has got it from something from the chilled beams. Perhaps someone has got it because they went to an unprotected water source. Perhaps someone else has got it because it's an endogenous gut organism that's translocated. And they are all different things that need slightly different actions and slightly different responses, but might not necessarily be an outbreak the way 2018 was, where we were linking everything to the single issue or the dual issues of contamination of the water and the problems with the drains.
But is that a fair characterisation of 2018? Because whilst it's true that the water in the drains was the big issue, we saw it in the report in May 2018 as being flagged as water as the primary source. Chill beams was being talked about in 2018, just perhaps not as loudly. Do you not recollect that?
There may have been, and certainly ventilation came in much later on in the conversations than the water and drains, but there was then, wasn't being discussed, I think, in terms of the ventilation as the source. It's a case of our control measures might not be as effective because the ventilation isn't the standard it should be, but the source is the water.
Because I'm wondering whether part of if it is a disagreement, part of this tension might have in its roots the fact that you, having arrived to some extent after a few previous involvements in early 2018 in these events, haven't been trying to work out what's wrong with the ventilation system, been dealing with the previous infections, and had maybe the arrival of the DMA Canyon report and its concerns wasn't quite as shocking to you as the people who, as it were, been through the previous 3 years, and therefore they see it as a whole thing, and you see it as just now. Do you see that as a possible tension in
Yes.
position? Because in terms of managing the relationship with the clinicians, I think you recognise the existence of the criticism, so I'm not going to take you through what they've actually said. How could the relationship with the clinicians in 2019, the second half of the year, last 4 months of the year, have been managed better to it? Because they wrote letters of concern to Dr. Armstrong, amongst others. How could that have been managed better to ensure that they weren't so perturbed by events?
I feel I can really talk from my own perspective and my interactions, and from my view, my reflections on it would be that working through those issues doesn't start in 2019, in the sense of, as you like saying, right, coming in February, March 2018, and I don't have the same relationship with these consultants as the staff who are working every day in the hospital, whether that's the general manager or the microbiologist. And not just accepting that the data being presented is speaking for itself, but spending time on helping them understand where I was coming from and what I was doing and what that data really meant. And I think things like, think about few, but they have regular unit meetings. Maybe it would be helpful for me to go along and join a conversation with them in a less formal surrounding than the IMT, so we could have more discussion and debate and getting that common understanding. I also think one of the issues potentially about the epidemiology work was it was never formally presented and discussed at the IMT.
Yes, no, you mentioned that in your statement. So we'll deal with what it means, because you've touched on it already this afternoon, but your second paper, your October 29 paper, that emerges after Dr. Crichton takes over.
No, just before.
Just before, in July.
In August. So I think it's the August 14th meeting, which is the one that...
Yes, I think it is mentioned there, yeah.
The discussion, which I wasn't, that I missed.
You arrived at the very end.
Yes. And it had been the previous meeting, which I think was the 8th or 9th of August. We were in this discussion around, well, what do we do next? If this is an escalating issue, what are the remaining options for us? And the effective option was closing the ward. And
there's a big squabble about the minutes around who's going to approve that change that happens on the 14th. That probably won't involve it.
Yes, and my recollection of the meeting, as I said, I can't quite recall it was the 8th or 9th, but the previous meeting was particularly to and fro. Myself, Dr. Inkster, Professor Gibson in particular, talking about well, how do we make this decision? And there was a point made, I think by one of the clinicians about, well, what's the data showing? And which was the point I said, well, I have done this report. You have not seen it. Dr. Inkster's got it. It'd be helpful perhaps if this goes out to the IMT. So it was only me asking that in the IMT that resulted in it being shared. And there was then this to and fro in that meeting about, well, this will take time to look at, and not just the EPI, but the whole situation to make the decision, and everyone's busy and no one's got time. And I said, well, we're all sitting here just now. But that meeting ended without a decision being made, and the decision to close the ward, I think, happened out with the IMT.
Yeah. And so I'll talk to you about what the reports say after lunch, but I want to turn to page 168 of your statement, where you discuss paragraph 165. There we are. Professor Jones and Professor Leonard agreeing in their opinion that from a microbiological point of view, Ward 6A was safe at the present time, and the IMT members accepted their position. Now, I think there's a moment when HPS require further convincing, but I'll just put that quietly to one side for the moment and look at, in a sense, why you seem to be comfortable with this conclusion.
Yes.
Right, now, the thought I had, we're going to come to the actual epidemiology at the time, but earlier in your statement, on page 146, you say something that possibly seems relevant. We talked about it earlier, paragraph 92. Halfway through. It's also important from an incident management principles point of view that you need to take epidemiology, microbiology, environmental, and clinical picture as a whole. You should not rely just on one of them and say we didn't need the epidemiology anymore. That's actually keeping with best practice. How would you react to the criticism that the conclusion that was made that the ward was microbiologically safe in the autumn of 2019 was to some extent doing that, in that it was relying rather heavily on the combination of two sources, whole genome sequencing and your epidemiology report, maybe a little bit from an HPS report as well, and not paying sufficient attention to the clinical picture as a whole, to the environmental issues? It was a sort of partial analysis. How do you respond to that? And clearly Professor Lennon can talk about himself next week.
Yeah, for me, the problem was at the point of it was just the microbiology. It was that these are the unusual organisms, and therefore, but we weren't taking into account the epidemiology, and it said it was I had to kind of push for my EP report to be shared. There hadn't been any real kind of broader descriptive epidemiology carried out
In 2019.
in 2019 by the infection control team or HPS. There was, at that meeting on the 14th of August, the presentation on environmental sampling. I'd read the presentation when it had come around in the papers, and I'd seen the notes in the minutes about effectively using that presentation to say, well, it doesn't matter that the environmental samples are fine because they're too unreliable. And I have an issue with that. The two of the key things, the epidemiology and the environmental sampling, were being put to one side. So if we take the environmental sampling, yes, absolutely take the point that only a proportion of any swabs you take will pick something up, and it's 25% is what's in the literature, and that's fine. But we hadn't done one swab or 10 swabs. There were dozens of environmental swabs and hundreds of water samples that were coming back principally really well. There were good results. So it felt like those negative results from the samples were being dismissed.
Right. So you would in a sense see there's a tension between one group of people in those meetings saying the environmental samples, we should dismiss those, we focus on the epidemiology in the ward and the story and the place and our fears. And you would say you focus on your epidemiology, the environmental samples, and the whole genome sequencing to tell the other story.
And not quite. I think there was you have the clinical picture, which is really important, and I was always very, these were real patients with real infections. These are the kids who were sick, and the microbiology and the nature of the microbiology on one side versus everything else. I wouldn't say it should be between those two things.
It should be a mix of them all.
It should be a mix of all of them.
Okay. Now, what I want to do is go back to page 168 of your statement. Paragraph 167. This is a teleconference IMT on the 20th of September. We have the minute, which is bundle 1, document 82. Which is page 370. And in it, there is, use JRO, Jennifer Rogers, circulate a PowerPoint presentation with all the current data. And for some reason, as far as we can tell, we don't have this. I'd be grateful if you could find it.
Yes.
And if you pass it to the CLO, and then they can get it to us. I think it would be just good to get the complete story, because I don't want to go into it in detail with you. I'm assuming that it fits in with the rest of your statement and it's just background information. But given it's got numbers in it, I think it would be nice to see how it... did it differ in any substantial way from your 2019 report that you had already produced?
It had more data in it. So, for example, I had the specific numbers for each infection. Each species of infection.
It went down by species level rather than by genus level, right? And did it extend further in time as well?
I think it probably would have done, yes.
And so would it help us to understand your understanding at the time of the diversity of organisms at that point?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you could dig it out, that would be great assistance. Now, the next thing is that over the page, I think it's over the page. No, it's the page before. So page 168, the paragraph before. I've been asked by the inquiry for my view on statement bundle. Page 168. That's it. 166. I've been asked by inquiry for my view on the current infection rates. I have not directly interrogated or reviewed the data since 2019. However, on the basis of the reporting through the infection control committees, so that's basically just you reading minutes effectively.
Well, I'm still in attendance at the infection control committees, but yeah.
There are no issues with infection rates currently. So what I'd like to understand, in broad sense, we've got 5 minutes before lunch, is how's that been achieved? The current, there are no issues. I appreciate there's been a pandemic and lots of time has passed, but from your point, narratively and in process, how have you got to the position you are in now?
So this week, indeed, as I said, there was a pandemic. So from kind of December 2019 onwards, I've stepped away from all of this. So there were the control measures already in place. There were the additional measures taken through the various hypotheses of the autumn 2019 MT. For example, I believe there was
So cleaning the chill beams
cleaning chill beams, putting the disinfectants in
in the water supply.
Further work on the fabric of 6A. But there's also the return to the newly refurbished wards 2A, 2B.
Yes.
I think that will have that environment is, my understanding of the best possible environment for that patient cohort.
And in terms of the non-environmental factors that were in discussion in 18 and 19, particularly in 19, around lines, hand washing practice, and people bringing in things they shouldn't bring in, not they're doing it deliberately, but they come in on their bodies. Has there been any developments in that area that seem important to you that have produced benefit?
And not that I'm aware of, as I said, I've not been involved recently. So.
Because before we get to the epidemiology, because the statement I make is a deeply non-epidemiological statement, it's just a sort of bald statement. If it's the case, as it does seem to be, that the rates are already well down now, and the events that have happened, the actions that have happened, the interventions that have happened since the autumn of 2019 are all pretty much environmental related. So they are cleaning the chill beams when they were around. There are no chill beams in 2A. Sorting out the chill water, the chill beams in 6A. Sorting out the fabric. And then moving back to 2A, which is an impressively different space than 6A, with all its air change rates and its filters and its lobby and its pressures and its everything. Is that not a relatively powerful piece of evidence that the environment was a problem? Because getting rid of the environment is what ultimately got rid of the problem.
Yes, and this comes back to our discussion in the first section when we were talking about the stepping down of that early 2018 IMT, and that the move from the old 2A to 6A improved things.
There's another
move
example
back from 6A to 2A has improved things further.
Yeah.
But would also want to be clear, I hope this is that, and it comes back to bundles, all those things around, for example, good line care and hand hygiene remain really important, and maintaining those standards is really important. And this is back to the chain of infection, because you have a source, but there needs to be a way of how does that source, passing from that source, then get into the patient, get into the patient's line. So absolutely acknowledging the benefits that the improved environment bring shouldn't be a reason to let up on all the other items in terms of infection prevention.
Okay, thank you. What I'm proposing to do, Lord, is we might break now, because my next section says epidemiological reports, and I think we should probably do that clean at 2 o'clock.
Absolutely. Dr. Kennedy, we'll take our lunch break now, and we'll sit again at 2 o'clock with the promise of some epidemiology.
If you could look at the IMT minutes for the Cryptococcus and see if there is a reference to case exception. I don't think there is, but if you can find it, I'd be obliged.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.